Hello! In this video we are going to go through Learning Target 6.2.2, which is on inverse trig. And in Learning Target 6.2.1, we talked about how to find the trig ratios, so finding the sine, cosine, and tangent of a right triangle. And today we are going to use the inverses of sine, cosine, and tangent to find missing angle measures. So being able to actually find the angle of that triangle. And so the inverses are actually pretty easy to remember. So just like addition is the inverse of subtraction, each of these have their inverse. So sine's inverse is written like this, and cosines the same way, and tangents as well. And for this learning target, to be able to do these inverse trig operations, you are going to need a calculator. And so if you have your own calculator, that's helpful. I'll show you what that looks like. And then you can also use Google's calculator. You just need to be really specific about what buttons you click to be able to use Google's. And I'll show you that as well. So what we're going to use this for is being able to find missing angles in right triangles. So we're going to write some steps out before we start. Steps to find missing angles. And we are going to be finding missing sides as well using this later this week. So step one is to circle the angle we want. So whatever one we're trying to find, we want to circle it. Kind of like in 6.2.1a, whichever angle we were talking about, we circled. In this case, whatever one we want, we circle. Step two, again, the same as 6.2.1, is to label our opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse sides. And step three is to choose sine, cosine, or tangent based on given info. So if you're only given information for sine, then you have to use sine. If you're only given the information for tangent, then you have to use tangent. And then we're going to use inverses, which are above, to calculate angle. So we're going to do a few examples of this, walking through those steps. So let's go through, here's our first. And it looks like this. So after you have that drawn, we're going to go through each of the steps. So the first step that we wrote down is to circle the angle that we want. And so for this one, we want to find the measure of angle Y. And so we are going to circle Y. Then we're going to label our opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse sides for angle Y. So hypotenuse is always across from the right angle. Opposite of Y is over here, and adjacent to Y is right here. So now we need to figure out what information we are given. And you can see we're given O and we're given A, but we are not given H. So sometimes I even like to, if I'm not given a letter, I'll scribble it out, or I won't even write it in the first place, because I can't do anything involving an H if I don't have a number. So using these two letters, I need to figure out what part of SOHCAH I am able to use. And so if I'm given O and A, the part with O and A is TOA. And so this tells me I need to use tangent for this problem. If you were given A and H, you would use cosine, and if you were given O and H, you would use sine. So now I'm going to set up my equation, and I'm going to use the tangent. So tangent of my angle, y, is equal to the opposite over adjacent. So 8.6 over 11. And so this is very similar to what we've already done, just setting up the ratio. So this is setting up the tangent ratio for angle y. The only difference is we were naming the angle ourselves and finding which of the SOHCAH TOA parts we were going to use. So now comes the time where if I want to find the measure of y, I need to get rid of this tangent part. And we want to do the inverse on both sides. So just like if this was a 3, and it said 3y, the inverse of multiplication is division. You would divide both sides. Now the inverse is tangent inverse, and you're going to do the tangent inverse of both sides. It sounds complicated, but really all you're doing is doing the inverse of your ratio. And so if you have a calculator, whatever calculator you have, you want to make sure that your mode is set to degrees instead of radians. So make sure it's set to degrees. And then we are going to do the inverse of tangent. So you see I have sine, cosine, and tangent buttons on my calculator, but in blue behind it I have those inverse buttons. So I'm going to hit the tangent inverse button and then type 8.6 divided by 11. And you hit equals, and that tells you your angle measure. And we can just round to like one decimal place. So I'm just going to do 38.0 because it tells me to round down with that one. So 38.0 degrees. This is an angle, so it's measured in degrees. So this is what it looks like on a calculator, that inverse tangent, inverse cosine, inverse sine. Now I want to show you what it looks like on Google's calculator, because I think most of you use some version of that, and so I want to show you that as well. So give me a second to set that up. Okay, so if we just type in calculator into Google, you'll get here. And the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure this mode is set to degrees. So whether you're using a calculator or the Google calculator, you want to have this set to degrees. And then we see sine, cosine, and tangent, but we don't see the inverses. And if you look right here, this INV is our inverse button. And now we can see our inverses. So I again wanted the tangent inverse, and this arctan means the same thing as tangent inverse. So don't get thrown off if it says that. That's totally normal. You don't need to know what it means. We're going to use the inverse symbol, not this. And I needed to type in 8.6 over 11. And I again get 38.0, and I'm going to round that. So this is how you use the Google calculator. So the important things are make sure it's in degrees, and then this inverse button shows you your inverses. Okay. So I want to go through one more example. Although they're all pretty similar, I think we could use another example of going through how to choose sine, cosine, or tangent. So let's say we have this example. We want to find the measure of angle R, and we're given this right triangle. And so again, our first step is to circle the angle that we want. So we want the measure of angle R. And then we want to label our opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse based on that angle. So across from the right angle is our H, across from the angle we are is O, and right next to it is A. And I don't have anything written for A, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that because we don't have that. If you have all three numbers, you just leave all these up there, and you're just going to have choices of which ratio you pick. So if I have all three, I can pick the opposite and the hypotenuse, or I can pick the adjacent and the hypotenuse, whichever one you want. And so for this one, I have only O and H. So if I look at SOH CAH TOA, I can see that I only have enough information to use the sine. So I'm going to set up my ratio for the sine. So the sine of R is opposite over hypotenuse, so 6.7 over 8.3. And then to use our inverses, again, we're just going to do the sine inverse of our ratio. And whether you're using the calculator on Google or your own, make sure that your mode is in degrees. If you're using your own calculator, it should stay like that. And this time we're using the sine inverse. So I'm going to hit the blue button, sine inverse of 6.7 over 8.3. And we get 53.8. And again, this is an angle, so we need to make sure that's in degrees. And I always like to look to see if my angle makes sense. So 53.8, looking at this picture, I know my picture is not perfect, but it does look like this could be 53.8 degrees. So remember, like a 90-degree angle would be straight up. 45 is kind of halfway, so this looks about to be 50 degrees. So I like that answer. If you accidentally use the wrong trig ratio, so let's say I accidentally tried to do like the tangent inverse of the same ratio. This gives me 38. Let's see what the cosine one does. And that gives me 36. And if I look at my picture, this looks a little bit too big to be in the 30s. And sometimes it's like, this is a little bit close, but sometimes it's, you know, a teeny tiny little angle and it tells you that it's like 80 degrees. And you know that that can't be possible because it's a teeny tiny angle. So use the picture to kind of double check your work. But this is how you find missing angles using your inverse trig ratios.